Avoidants are notorious for their boomerang pattern, leaving relationships only to circle back weeks, months, or even years later when their delayed emotional processing catches up with their actions. This predictable return has become so expected that many people wait indefinitely, convinced that given enough time and space, their avoidant will eventually come back. However, certain specific behaviors signal something different entirely: a permanent departure rather than a temporary withdrawal. These behaviors indicate that the avoidant has made an internal decision so final that no amount of waiting, hoping, or changed circumstances will bring them back. Understanding these signals prevents wasted years waiting for someone who has already closed the door permanently from their side. They completely erase your shared history. The first definitive sign of permanent departure appears when the avoidant systematically removes all traces of the relationship from their life with cold, calculated precision. This goes far beyond the normal post-breakup clearing of belongings or unfollowing on platforms. This is comprehensive erasure, deleting photos, disposing of gifts, removing anything that serves as a reminder of shared experiences, and speaking about the relationship as though it barely existed or meant nothing significant. Their psychology engages in this erasure as a protective mechanism against the delayed grief they know will eventually surface. By eliminating physical and digital evidence of the connection, they're attempting to prevent future emotional processing from occurring. They understand on some unconscious level that keeping reminders will eventually trigger the feelings they're desperately trying to avoid, so they preemptively destroy anything that might serve as an emotional catalyst later. This behavior differs fundamentally from the avoidant who keeps small mementos hidden away or maintains photos in archived folders. That avoidant is protecting their emotional escape hatch, preserving evidence of what mattered even as they deny its importance. But the avoidant who engages in complete erasure has made a different psychological calculation. They're burning bridges rather than simply walking away from them, ensuring they cannot easily return even if they wanted to. The thoroughness of this erasure reveals their internal certainty about never returning. They're not protecting themselves from getting hurt again or maintaining distance until they feel safer. They're attempting to rewrite history itself, to exist as though the relationship never reached the depth it actually did. This psychological maneuver indicates they've decided the connection is too dangerous to their defensive structure to allow any pathway back. When an avoidant removes someone from every aspect of their life, so completely that mutual friends remark on the totality of the erasure, when they speak about the relationship in past tense with emotional flatness that suggests it belongs to someone else's life rather than their own, they've crossed a threshold of finality. They've decided that whatever pain the relationship caused, or whatever fear it triggered, outweighs any potential value in maintaining even the possibility of future reconnection. They immediately establish serious connection with someone new. The second unmistakable sign emerges when the avoidant moves directly into a new serious relationship with unusual speed and commitment. Avoidants typically maintain casual connections or remain single for extended periods between relationships, needing significant time and space to recover from the intimacy of their previous connection. When they bypass this pattern and dive into something serious almost immediately, they're engaging in psychological replacement rather than avoidance. This rapid new connection serves a specific purpose. It creates an insurmountable psychological barrier, preventing return to the previous relationship. By investing in someone new, they're not just moving on. They're building a wall between themselves and their past that becomes increasingly difficult to dismantle as time passes. The new relationship functions as their declaration of finality, a public statement that they've chosen a different direction permanently. Their nervous system employs this strategy when they're genuinely terrified of their own potential to return. They know their pattern of delayed emotional processing, know they'll likely miss their former partner eventually, so they create circumstances that make acting on those future feelings nearly impossible. The new relationship becomes a self-imposed prison that prevents them from following their boomerang instinct. This differs entirely from rebound connections or casual dating. When an avoidant introduces a new partner to friends and family quickly, speaks about future plans, or demonstrates commitment behaviors they never showed in the previous relationship, they're signaling that they've made an irreversible choice. They're showing rather than telling that they've permanently redirected their emotional investment elsewhere. The tragic irony is that this new connection often develops not because the new person is objectively better or more compatible, but because the new relationship hasn't yet triggered the avoidant's deepest fears. They haven't reached the level of intimacy that activated their flight response in the previous relationship. They're able to show up fully precisely because the stakes haven't risen high enough to threaten them yet. They speak about you with cold detachment or criticism. The third definitive sign appears in how the avoidant discusses the ended relationship with others. When they speak about their former partner with emotional coldness that borders on clinical detachment, or worse, with criticism and negative framing that rewrites the relationship's reality, they've engaged in a psychological self-protection mechanism that prevents return. Avoidants who plan to possibly return maintain some warmth in how they discuss their former partner, even if they minimize the relationship's significance. They might downplay the depth of connection, but they don't assassinate their former partner's character or reframe the entire relationship as a mistake. That neutral to positive framing keeps the door cracked open for potential reconciliation when their delayed processing eventually occurs. However, the avoidant who has permanently departed needs to justify their choice not just to others, but to themselves. They cannot maintain the cognitive dissonance of believing they made the right decision, while also acknowledging they left someone wonderful who loved them genuinely. So they engage in revisionist history, emphasizing their former partner's flaws, reframing normal relationship challenges as deal breakers, and constructing a narrative where leaving was not just right but necessary for their well-being. This character reconstruction serves multiple psychological functions. It insulates them against their own future feelings by creating a negative emotional association with their former partner. It justifies their departure to friends and family who might otherwise question their choice. And most critically, it builds an internal story so solid that returning would require dismantling their entire self-justification structure, something their ego cannot easily tolerate. When an avoidant tells others that their former partner was too needy, too emotional, or too much, when they frame the relationship as something they had to escape rather than something they chose to leave, they're building psychological fortifications against their own potential regret. They're pre-defending their decision against their future self who might miss what they lost. The permanence of this approach becomes evident when mutual acquaintances report that the avoidant's description of the relationship doesn't match what they witnessed. When friends who saw the avoidant being loved, supported, and cared for hear them describe the relationship as burdensome or unhealthy, the disconnect reveals the depth of psychological work the avoidant is doing to ensure they never question their departure enough to consider return. They cut off all mutual connections and shared spaces. The fourth signal of permanent departure manifests when the avoidant systematically removes themselves from any context where they might encounter their former partner. This goes beyond avoiding direct contact. They withdraw from mutual friend groups, stop attending places they might cross paths, and create complete physical and social separation. This behavior indicates they're not protecting themselves during a temporary withdrawal, but rather establishing a permanent divide. Avoidants who plan to potentially return maintain some thread of connection to their former partner's world. They keep mutual friendships active, continue participating in shared communities, and allow for the possibility of organic reconnection through natural life overlap. This passive proximity creates opportunities for their delayed processing to manifest in renewed contact when they're emotionally ready. But the avoidant who severs all mutual connections has decided that maintaining any pathway to their former partner poses too great a risk to their psychological equilibrium. They understand that seeing updates through mutual friends, hearing about their former partner's life, or encountering them unexpectedly would trigger feelings they've determined to avoid permanently. So they make the costly choice to sacrifice entire social circles and communities to ensure complete separation. This severance often confuses mutual friends who find themselves receiving implicit or explicit ultimatums about maintaining both connections. The avoidant might stop attending events if their former partner will be there, request that friends not share information about their ex, or simply ghost entire friend groups, rather than navigate the discomfort of proximity. This scorched earth approach to social connection reveals the depth of their fear and the finality of their decision. The psychological investment required to maintain this level of separation is enormous. It's uncomfortable, lonely, and often requires explaining to confused friends why someone would choose isolation over simply being civil with an ex. An avoidant only makes this sacrifice when they've determined that any contact or information about their former partner threatens their defensive structure so profoundly that social loss is preferable to emotional vulnerability. When an avoidant is willing to lose friendships, abandon communities, and restructure their entire social life to avoid any trace of their former partner, they're demonstrating that return isn't just unlikely. It's impossible within their current psychological framework. They've decided the relationship represents such a threat to their sense of self that they must create absolute distance to maintain their emotional equilibrium. They refuse all communication with absolute consistency. The fifth unmistakable sign appears when the avoidant maintains absolute radio silence with unwavering consistency, refusing to respond to any attempts at contact regardless of the reason or method. This differs from typical avoidant withdrawal, which usually includes occasional responses or eventual breakthrough when emotions settle. The avoidant who never responds, who blocks on every platform, who returns messages unopened, has made a decision that transcends their usual push-pull pattern. Most avoidants leave some line of communication open, even if they use it rarely or inconsistently. They might respond to important questions, acknowledge birthday wishes, or engage with neutral topics while avoiding emotional discussions. This selective availability reflects their ambivalence. They want distance, but not total disconnection. They're protecting themselves while keeping the door cracked for potential future contact. The avoidant who shuts down communication completely has crossed into different psychological territory. They've decided that any contact, even superficial or logistical, poses too great a risk of emotional entanglement. They understand their own vulnerability to being drawn back in through small interactions that escalate into larger ones, so they eliminate the possibility entirely by refusing all contact without exception. This absolute boundary demonstrates that they're protecting themselves not just from their former partner, but from themselves, from their own potential to soften, to miss, to reconsider. They don't trust themselves to maintain distance if they allow even minimal interaction, so they create an external structure that prevents them from acting on feelings that might emerge later. When months or years pass without a single response to any communication attempt, when significant life events elicit no acknowledgement, when even practical necessities receive no reply, the avoidant has made their position devastatingly clear. They've chosen permanent silence over any form of connection, signaling that return isn't in their consideration even remotely. They express explicit finality with no ambiguity. The sixth definitive sign occurs when the avoidant communicates their departure with unusual directness and finality, lacking the typical ambiguity that characterizes avoidant endings. Most avoidants leave relationships with vague language that preserves options. I need space. I can't do this right now. This isn't working for me at the moment. These phrases contain implicit temporariness, suggesting that circumstances might change. But the avoidant who says, I will never come back, this is permanently over. I'm certain this was the wrong relationship for me, is engaging in atypical communication for their attachment style. Avoidants typically avoid definitive statements because such statements feel too confrontational and also eliminate their future options. When they bypass their usual ambiguity for explicit finality, they're overriding their normal communication patterns because the message matters more than their comfort. This directness serves as a gift and a warning. They're telling their former partner in the clearest terms possible that waiting is futile, that hope is misplaced, that moving on is the only rational response. They're being more honest and explicit than their attachment style typically allows because they're trying to prevent their former partner from wasting time waiting for a return that will never happen. The psychological cost of this directness is significant for an avoidant. It requires confronting their former partner's potential pain, tolerating the discomfort of closure, and accepting responsibility for the relationship's ending. Avoidants usually avoid all of these through vagueness and ambiguity. When they choose directness despite the discomfort, they're demonstrating that their decision to leave permanently is so certain it outweighs their conflict avoidance. When an avoidant explicitly tells someone they're never coming back and maintains that position consistently without softening or qualifying it over time, they mean it. They're not engaging in their typical push-pull dance. They're making a statement about their future that they've decided with unusual certainty for someone who typically lives in emotional ambiguity, the internal shift that makes return impossible. Understanding why these behaviors indicate permanent departure requires examining the internal shift that occurs in the avoidant before these external behaviors manifest. Something fundamental changes in how they view the relationship, their former partner, or themselves that makes return psychologically impossible within their current framework. Sometimes, this shift involves the avoidant deciding that the relationship activated wounds too deep to risk approaching again. They recognize on some level that this particular connection threatened their defensive structure in ways others haven't, accessing parts of them they're not ready or willing to address. Rather than face those wounds, they choose permanent distance from what triggered them. Other times, the shift involves the avoidant constructing a new identity that doesn't include their former partner. They've decided who they are and who they want to be, and that vision has no room for the relationship they left. Returning would require abandoning this new self-concept, creating cognitive dissonance they're unwilling to tolerate. Occasionally, the shift stems from shame so profound that facing their former partner again feels intolerable. The avoidant recognizes they hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and their guilt manifests not as desire to make amends, but as determination to never confront the consequences of their actions. They stay away not because they don't care, but because they care enough to feel ashamed, and their shame paralyzes them into permanent distance. Whatever the internal cause, these behaviors reflect a psychological door closing from the inside. The avoidant has decided something about the relationship, their former partner, or themselves that makes return feel impossible even if circumstances changed. They're not waiting to feel ready or safe. They've concluded that ready and safe aren't attainable within the context of that relationship. The difference between permanent departure and typical withdrawal. Distinguishing permanent departure from typical avoidant withdrawal requires understanding that avoidants usually keep their options open even while insisting they're done. They maintain ambiguity, preserve some connections, leave communication channels available, and avoid burning bridges completely. This hedging allows them to return when their delayed emotional processing catches up to their actions. Permanent departure looks and feels different. It's scorched earth rather than strategic retreat. It's definitive rather than ambiguous. It's consistent rather than fluctuating. The avoidant who has permanently left displays sustained, coordinated behaviors across multiple areas, all designed to create insurmountable distance rather than manageable space. The challenge is that in the immediate aftermath of separation, these behaviors might look similar. An avoidant might erase photos, avoid contact, and speak with detachment during the initial withdrawal phase. The difference emerges over time. The typical avoidance resolve softens. They start selectively responding to messages, stop actively avoiding mutual spaces, or their emotional tone warms when discussing their former partner. The permanently departed avoidant shows no such softening. Months become years with no change in their absolute boundaries. Their erasure stays complete. Their new relationship becomes established. Their communication remains closed. Their narrative about the relationship stays negative or coldly detached. Time doesn't soften their position, it reinforces it. The painful truth about waiting. For those left behind, understanding these signs serves a critical purpose. It prevents wasted years waiting for someone who has made a permanent decision. The hope that avoidants always come back has created a culture of indefinite waiting, where people put their lives on hold, believing that time and space will eventually bring their avoidant back to them. But when an avoidant displays these behaviors, waiting becomes self-harm. They're not processing their feelings slowly. They're actively working to never process them. They're not taking space to figure things out. They figured things out and decided on permanent distance. They're not afraid of intimacy in general. They've decided this specific intimacy is something they'll never choose again. The painful truth is that sometimes avoidants make permanent choices, and those choices deserve to be respected even when they hurt. Waiting for someone who has explicitly or implicitly communicated they're never coming back isn't hope, it's denial. It's refusing to accept a truth clearly communicated through sustained behavior over time. Moving on from an avoidant who has permanently departed requires accepting that their delayed processing might eventually make them miss what they lost, but that missing won't translate into return. They might someday realize they destroyed something valuable, but they've created so many barriers to acting on that realization that it will remain internal knowledge that never manifests as changed behavior. The kindest thing someone can do for themselves when faced with these signs is believe the avoidant's behavior over their own hope. The avoidant who has permanently departed isn't being cruel. They're being clear in the only language they know how to speak. They're showing through their actions what their words might have failed to adequately communicate. They're gone, they're not coming back, and waiting won't change that reality. The only question remaining is how long someone will wait